Noon or good morning or wherever you might be in the world. Michael's in Australia, so I'm not sure exactly what time it is there. What time is it, Michael?
It's 9 a.m. exactly.
Wow.
But I'm a
Uh,
day ahead of you. So, as I said, I've said this before, I've seen the future. It's all right. Tomorrow's going to get here.
It will.
and
Well,
it's winter in Australia, and here
Yes.
it's
And
100
so
and
I'm
some
wearing a
odd
scarf
degrees.
and I have a heater at my feet.
Right. Anyway, this is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're always delighted to have Michael Robotham with us. This is the brand new book, The White Crow, and we have unsigned copies. I mean, he is in Australia, but they read just as well. And I'll put a link in the comments field if you'd like to purchase a copy from us. We'd always appreciate the support. Um, what else can I say, Barbara? Over to you.
you can say that Michael talked about Philomena's first appearance in the world, and Patrick has a link to the YouTube video. So if you've forgotten about Philomena and her initial adventure, Patrick is going to post the link, or you can go to poisonpen.com and go to YouTube. And then the easy way to do anything on YouTube is to write Michael Robotham Poisoned Pen. And then everything Michael and I have done that is on Poison Pen will show up. So um, either
It's
way, it's
been
a
a,
winner.
it's
But
been a few.
I wish we'd had streaming on your one visit to the bookstore all those years ago, with one of my still most favorite of your novels. But unfortunately, that was long ago, wasn't it? How long ago was it, actually?
I don't even remember. Well, last year I celebrated 20 years since the first book was published. So it's probably 18 years, maybe
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, maybe
years
15
ago.
or
Yeah.
18 years
What, do you
ago.
remember the book? I can't remember the book,
It was
Barbara.
The Night Fairy.
Oh, yeah, that was the third book. So that was probably 2007.
Yeah, long time ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, an
I forgot
amazing book.
part of my spiel, which is if you have questions for Michael, go ahead and type them in, and Barbara will bring me on screen towards the end of the hour, and I'd be happy to ask any of your questions.
Thank
So
you.
into the darkness I go.
Wonderful. We'll start over again. So, Michael, How I Love This Book. It's actually our British crime selection for July. I was
Thank you.
so delighted to read it. I love a good police procedural. And there have been many coming from the UK recently, although the US seems to have kind of left the procedural behind.
It's funny, I don't write many, as you know, many procedurals. I mean, during the course
No.
of my career, I've normally, written psychologists or, have had my as my protagonists and stayed away from the police force. And this is probably the closest you say to a police procedural as I've done. And I had enormous, as you probably tell, I had enormous amount of fun writing it because
Yes.
quite a bit of humor in there.
Well, you had a lot of fun writing it, and it has a really complex plot. And no character is any one thing. I really like that, that there's well, you've always been great at that. You've always been great at drawing characters who are not any one thing. I think the psychology of it must truly fascinate you. How many good and bad qualities can you put into one person and make them believable?
Yeah, I think that comes back from, many years ago, in my previous career as a ghostwriter. And I know I've mentioned before, I worked with a brilliant psychologist called Paul Britton, who was the pioneer of offender profiling and psychological profiling in Britain. And that's one of the things he taught me. He worked on a lot of celebrated British crimes, like Fred and Rosemary West and Jamie Bolger and terrible crimes. But he taught me that people don't just have three dimensions, they have so many more dimensions, and that everyone has secrets. You may think you've known someone your entire life, but you don't realize they will have secrets, that you don't know about. And that fascinates me.
Well, it should. It's not just that they have secrets, but they have complex loyalties. And
Yeah.
that's a difficult choice for Philomena as a police officer in this book. That is one of the things she has to deal with. Who is she? Where do her loyalties lie? And how can she manage them without reaching them so badly
Yeah.
that they'll never be recovered?
I probably should set it up for the watchers. So
Sure.
basically, the main character is Philomena McCarthy. She's a young, ambitious, newly married policewoman working in the London Metropolitan Police. But she's defied the odds to become a police officer because she comes from a family of notorious East End gangsters. Her father is Eddie McCarthy. Her uncles are Finbar, Clifton, and Dara. And they once formed the most feared gang in East London. They've now gone straight. Apparently, they're now property developers and facilitators. Philomena has to walk this very fine line, I call it a very fine blue line, keeping the two sides of her life apart. She's an only child, so Eddie McCarthy would very much like to bring her back into the fold, into the family, but she loves her career as a police officer. And I guess the setup for the White Crow, or actually I should explain the title of the White Crow. In many parts of the world, particularly in Europe, they don't refer to the black sheep of the family. They refer to the White Crow in the family. And Philomena, obviously in her family, being the only clean skin, really, she is the ultimate White Crow in her family. And you sort of know, even before this book starts, with that setup, that their two worlds are going to collide in some sort of spectacular way.
Well, you absolutely do. But I like Eddie a lot, her father, reprobate though he may be. And one of the things that's fun about reading the book is that you get to hear what's happening, or you see what's happening from different points of view. It's not all Philomena. Sometimes it is her father and all,
Yeah, which is unusual for me because, as you know, most of my books have been written in the first person. With the Cyrus and Evie series, it was two voices, but this is one of the first times I've ever had multiple voices. So Philomena is told in the first person, but you hear from Eddie McCarthy, the father, and you hear from the detective. At the heart of this story, and it's not giving anything away, there is a terrible robbery, and Philomena, stumbles upon this crime, but increasingly all the evidence points towards her family as being the perpetrators. So you just know that there's going to be massive conflict there. But you hear from Eddie McCarthy, and you hear from Detective Keegan, who's investigating the crime. And you hear from another one of her uncles, Dara, he's my favorite. Dara McCarthy is my favorite of the. he's a man of little brain. I mean,
okay.
I shouldn't love my own lines, but Dara is the muscle. He's the sort of, all the uncles have a role. Okay, and Dara is the muscle, and he's a lovable psychopath. And there's a description of Dara. His life of violence began when he came out of the womb. The midwife slapped him on the ass, and Dara slapped her back.
Yeah, it was a wonderful moment. But I have to say that my heart sort of went to Henry, Philomena's firefighter husband, who I think is a marvel of a man.
Yeah, it's funny. As you know, I don't plot these books in advance. And this is a very complicated Swiss watch of a book with all these moving parts. And for a long while, I kept thinking, how am I going to get Henry into this story? Because he's a lovely husband, and he's a long-suffering husband, and he loves Philomena and he wants to start a family and all that. But how can I bring him in? And I'm not giving anything away. But when I finally the idea dawned on me and how he was going to come into this story, I realized that from being a bit player that I worried about, he was going to be front and center of the last half of this book.
He absolutely is. And if you don't write a sequel to it, so we know how some of this comes out, I'm going to come to Australia and strangle you with the scarf that you're wearing.
No, you need
Yeah.
worry about that. No, I've had my American publishers and my British publishers and other people whispering in my ear saying, we think Philomena is a keeper. You're gonna have to do some more with her. So there will be another Philomena book coming.
Well, it's not just Philomena. I think that we deserve to hear from some of the other characters that you've had in the story, such as Henry. Um, and you're right. I mean, it doesn't have to be a long series. You have written a very long series with Joe, and you've written a lot of standalones, but you could do a
Yeah.
trilogy.
Oh
I
no,
just want one more. Okay, I'm not that
yeah,
great.
it's funny. I should tell you the story. When I wrote When You Were Mine, which was the first of the Philomena books, I thought it was a standalone. I think I probably talked to you when if I go back and watch that interview that we did for the first book, the conversation, I probably said it was a standalone.
You did.
And a strange thing happened. That was a book about coercive control, and it was particularly a book about police officers failing to investigate uh, domestic violence crimes if they're committed by other police officers. And I thought, well, how helpless would you be as the victim if the very people you would turn to help the police, wouldn't help you. And similarly, if your partner had access to be able to track your phone, track your car, knew the location of every woman's shelter, I mean, you would be completely helpless. So I wrote When You Were Mine, and very soon after that book was published, there was a terrible murder in London of a young woman called Sarah Everard, got murdered by an off-duty police officer who had a history of violence against women and had not been caught and had not been disciplined. And he masqueraded as an officer and he murdered this woman. And suddenly the book, When You Were Mine, became incredibly prescient, I suppose. It was sort of art, life imitating art, or vice versa. I can't remember which way it goes. But that's been picked up as a TV series in the UK. So Philomena and the gangster family are in development as a TV series. So that's why I decided to do Philomena again. I just thought it's a wonderful dynamic to have this police officer from a gangster family. And B, I thought if there's going to be a TV series, I'd love to have a second story available to them, should it all go ahead as planned.
We had this conversation last night, Brad Thor and I did, because we did his book launch for your publisher, about a breakout book or a successful book or even the start of a career can often depend on luck, on things happening in the outside world that you, the author, have no control over, nor could you actually generally foresee it, because by the time you've written the book and it goes through the whole publishing process, so much time has elapsed, it would be unlikely that you could have had that forward vision. And that's so true. I often think about that. People are constantly asking me either, how did you know? Because I've bought something that turned out to be brilliant. Or to explain a phenomenon like John Grisham's The Firm. And I remind people that John could not have known that the year The Firm published was the first year that law firms were allowed to advertise in the United States. And therefore, people were perfectly willing to consider the idea of a crooked law firm. And similarly, when the Da Vinci Code published, think about what was happening in the world when that book came out.
Yeah,
The Pope was dying.
That's right.
The pedophilia running through the clergy had become visible. And therefore, people were prone were willing to accept the idea of a corrupt Catholic Church. Those are just two kind of obvious examples.
And I look at also, I mean, there's so much luck involved. You take someone like, Harlan Coben, and having a president being seen getting off the chopper, coming back from Camp David with a book tucked under his arm, and everyone wondering what's the president reading, and it's a Harlan Coben book, and so suddenly that Harlan Coben just went bang. It can be something, or and similarly, we all know those sort of horror stories where the opposite happens. And one famous one was a book that was sold for enormous amounts of money at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and about the day before it was due out, it was called Towers of Silence, and it was set in the World Trade Center. The day before it came out, the World Trade Center got destroyed, and the book had to be withdrawn, and that career just died then and there.
It is wild. David Baldacci reminded me at Thriller Fest, which I went to in New York last week, that it's possible that his first book, Absolute Power, will have a renaissance due to the fact that, the narcissistic, totally corrupt president who is the subject of that book.
Who could that be?
Was thought to be fiction when he wrote it. So, I mean, that's a long curve. That's a very long curve.
No, it is. Planets have to line up. I mean, I think the book has got to be ultimately, it's as you know, a brilliant marketing campaign might get a book, onto a list. But the only thing that keeps it there is word of mouth. I mean, if The Firm hadn't been a cracking book, it would not have sold in the millions it did. Ultimately, it has to be the book, but what gets that book into the hands of readers to begin with, just a certain number, that tipping point, as you know, that tipping point moment, that's the big uncertainty.
It is. It sort of makes publishing kind of a sophisticated version of Las Vegas. You go to the casino.
I know it's funny. Every time I write a book, I describe it as what I'm doing is I'm buying another lottery ticket,
Yeah.
and this could be the one that sort of wins the big prize.
It could. Well, you've had incredibly good reviews, not just from me, but from big media. And I'm going to quote from one, a starred review from Publishers Weekly. London Metropolitan Police Constable Philomena McCarthy returns in Robotham's rip-roaring sequel to When You Are Mine. And again, I point you to the fact that you can watch Michael and me talk about that book from a couple of years back. When Philomena and her partner catch a glimpse of a barefoot child hiding in a yard in a very posh neighborhood, well, and that's a great scene too, I might add, where Philomena thinks she sees this little foot and goes after it, and that leads her
Mhm.
into um, a crime scene. Anyway, they take the girl to her home and find her mother murdered, very badly murdered. A few miles away, a jewelry store is robbed, and the owner is forced to put on a suicide vest before the assailants escape. After one of Philomena's colleagues frees him, the store owner asks about his wife, who turns out to be the dead woman Philomena discovered, and the action kicks into high gear. So sometimes there's just coincidence at play and things like
Mm.
this. But I really love, I'm not going to read any more of that, but the last paragraph of this review is so true. Robotham nimbly balances Philomena's psychological stresses with vigorous action and sharp dialogue. The plot is sleek and elegant, with interlocking storylines that culminate in a big bloody finale. And then I add, but then a quiet and satisfying coda. I can't wait for Philomena's return. So.
There you go. That's always nice.
It is nice, isn't it? But I did think that your way into the story of Philomena, I can't remember what she was doing because I read it a little while ago.
She was on a food run. She and her partner were working nights at the Kentish Town Police Station, and as always happens, there's only one place or a few places in London at 3 o'clock in the morning you can get something to eat. So they were on a food run for their colleagues when they stumbled upon a barefoot child in pajamas. Mm.
Right. And so Philomena, feels that she can't just abandon this child, even though, they've got food and they're supposed to be.
The partner didn't see the child, so basically, yeah, Philomena is saying no, there was definitely someone there. And at that precise moment, they're called to a jewelry robbery, and Philomena refuses to leave and says, "You go, I'm going to find this child."
Right.
Mm.
So I know you don't plot things, but how does this kind of opening scene come to you?
Um, I just um, all I knew is and like most crime novels require a certain amount of coincidence. You don't want it to be ridiculous. I think Edgar Allan Poe said a line that you don't want to write with God on your lap that everything has to happen because God made some miraculous sort of coincidence happen. But this required a little bit of a coincidence. The fact that at that precise moment, I knew that I needed to have the criminal family and Philomena's lives collide. And of course, this jewelry robbery, this is not giving too much away, but as police investigate the robbery in this jewelry store, and millions are missing, and this home invasion, all the evidence begins to point towards Philomena's family as being the perpetrators, and she is caught then in this situation, of she wants to believe them, but she also thinks if you've done this, if you've committed this crime, then you deserve to go down. And so I guess that was just the setup that I thought I needed crime, and and I thought with someone like the McCarthy brothers, the thing is, with that family, they are involved, but they're not involved, and the reader will discover how they're involved. They're not involved the way that people think they're involved.
No, absolutely true. I mean, in a way, it's Philomena who spots the child and then is called to the robbery. But the truth is, the child wouldn't have been out crawling around, barefoot in
Yeah,
her pajamas if something awful wasn't happening. So that part of it is perfectly plausible. The fact that it's the
yeah.
same person, and I really like the McCarthy side of this story, which we won't go into. But there's another whole track. Um,
Yeah.
that's going on with Philomena's family, and you wonder whether the tracks will converge or whether the tracks will turn out to be, they can't really
Yeah.
be parallel, but they can diverge and be not what you expect. So
Yeah.
did you figure that out too?
I figured nothing out at the time. Well, it all sort of, that's the magic of writing, I think, for me. As I said, I knew I wanted this, I knew I wanted the setup, and then I had no idea how it was going to resolve itself. And I guess, one of the issues with criminal families like the McCarthys is, as big and as bad as mean as you can be, there's probably always someone out there who's bigger and badder and meaner that wants, and as much as you've stolen to get where you are, there's always someone out there that's willing to steal from you, and this sort of conflict, you know, uh, because her father now, I think in the first book, When You Were Mine, Eddie McCarthy turned 60, which is one of the reasons that he draws Philomena back into his. She had been estranged from her father for 10 years in that first book. And he draws her back in because it's his 60th birthday and he's in ill health. And so, that's the thing with aging, crime figure is this younger, hungrier rivals that are just snapping at your heels. And, there comes a point in time you have to prove again and again who the big dog is, and which I loved about it. And I think it's interesting you say you love the McCarthys. I did an event last night here in Sydney with someone who said that they thought they were a bit in love with the McCarthys, and which is odd given that they're criminals.
I
um,
don't know. I think many criminals actually survive partly on charm.
yeah, that's true. But I think I wanted to make them old school. I should tell you this story, actually. It's quite fascinating in terms of where they came from. There is actually a real life gangster in London who's known as the Big Fella. His name is David Hunt. He's 6'5" tall. And just like the McCarthys, he made his money, his fortune during the London Olympics in 2013, where he provided a lot of the infrastructure or particularly the waste management for the Olympic Village. And I'll tell you what he's like. He sued the Sunday Times in about 2013. He sued them for libel because they'd called him a gangster. And on the first day of the libel trial in London, the Sunday Times had hired 5 bodyguards to protect their witnesses, and all their bodyguards disappeared. And then the next day, they had to get more bodyguards in. And ultimately, David Hunt lost, and the actual judge he said, no, I think you are a gangster. His barrister said he was just a little misunderstood. Um, and so when I created the McCarthys, I'd read about the Hunt family, and I thought, and I wanted the McCarthys to be the sort of gangsters. I mean, they have done bad things. They are violent men, but they don't deal in sort of human misery in terms of people trafficking or sex trafficking or drugs. They're different sorts of gangsters, I guess. And they have a code and they have a huge sense of family.
I think any large city, property development is like an open invitation to crime and corruption. I mean, there are many novels in which, and there's so much money involved. That's it too. If you want really high stakes and you don't want to go the drugs route, where are you going to find enough money? And property development is certainly. I mean, we just had a shopping mall here in Scottsdale sell for some extraordinary amount of money, and the last paragraph of it, which bodes ill for the current tenants, the new owner said that when the current leases expire, they'll be terminating them in order to bring in new tenants who will like upgrade the property. And I thought to myself, okay, I mean, I could envision a crime novel arising from that.
But I crossed one the other day. I was doing research for another book the other day, and where an old hospital, an abandoned hospital, the local community wanted to buy it to turn into old people's retirement village. And it was sold, they were getting the money together. It was sold for a ridiculously low amount of money to a developer who then on-sold it within 6 months for 3 times the amount of money that he paid, all without the community. And the community would have paid the money that he paid originally, and it was all just corruption. It was all, It's funny, there's a scene in The White Crow, you probably remember, where Philomena is approached and asked if she would, help investigate the family. They had the McCarthy family. And this particular person says to them, we're not actually after McCarthy's. We're after the people they bribe. We're after the politicians that are in their pockets, the council officials that are in their pockets. They're the people we want. The McCarthy's, we know they're criminals.
Right.
He said, we want to get the people that are on their payroll.
So when I was in London last June for capital crimes, in fact, I think you and I had a little email conversation about that.
We've been seeing each other. It's a shame.
Yeah, we didn't see each other in person, but at one point, I think it might have been on the Sunday, the convention is held in a hotel right by St. Paul's Cathedral. So if you go out the door and turn right, you can walk down to the Thames and step onto the Millennial Bridge, which I have done in the past. And so I did, and I looked downriver and I realized that I can't see the Tower of London because of all the glittering glass, enormously tall high rises that have now been developed. And that whole area is becoming extremely posh and all. And you can just see the money. You absolutely can see it when you look out there. Isle of Dogs is another great example.
I think there's actually, I think there's a scene in The White Crow where Dara, one of the McCarthy brothers, he sort of says, people think that we're the criminals, but the real criminals are the people that are living in those glass towers, those glass and chrome towers. They're the people that are making the serious money. They're the serious, and they're doing the serious crimes. It's funny. Another factor in this book was, you remember that in my past I was a ghostwriter.
Yeah.
And I ghostwrote sort of many books for people, well-known people. But one of the people that I ghostwrote for was a man called Bruce Reynolds, and he was the mastermind behind the Great Train Robbery. It was known as the crime of the century. He was the ringleader. It was the Glasgow Mail train on August the 8th in 1963. 15 men hijacked the Glasgow Mail train. And they stole 2.6 million pounds, which in today's money is worth about 100 million US.
Yeah.
They stole. And it was 1963, and it was the first television crime, really, because TV was just coming into being. And these guys were regarded as actual folk heroes by the British public. They thought these guys were heroes because it was money that was destined to be incinerated. It didn't belong to anyone. It was being taken out of circulation because it was slightly soiled or torn. So it was like a victimless crime. But the establishment, when they finally caught these guys, which took a long while, I mean, Bruce Reynolds was on the run for 5 years and, living in Mexico and in Spain and the like. When they were finally caught, they were given 25-year sentences, which was longer than you'd get for multiple murder because the British establishment just could not handle that the public actually adored these guys. And they were all, like Bruce Reynolds was a proper East End crim. He modeled himself on 1955 To Catch a Thief came out. You remember the wonderful Cary Grant To Catch a Thief? Well, he got his suits made at the same tailor that Cary Grant got his suits made at. And he spent 3 months of his year in the south of France driving sports cars around. And then he would rob the houses, the country houses, and then be having dinner at the Ivy and the Savoy Grill with the very people he'd just robbed. He was a complete but he was an East End sort of gangster, but he modeled himself on Cary Grant.
I love it. Well, Cary Grant I don't think he was in East End, but Cary Grant was not actually ever Cary Grant, which is fun. Well, with the British, I mean, come on, where's the whole folk hero Robin Hood kind of a thing? I think the British public they used to root for highwaymen. I mean, you could read all kinds of historical fiction where the highwayman, is a glamorous figure.
Yeah, but and that's true, but the establishment, the wealthy, they hated that. And so the British have always had this history of actually punishing property crimes more harshly than crimes against the person.
You're so right. Think about Dickens, in ordinance sentences that, little petty thieves and
Yeah.
pickpockets could, there's a new book out here by Allison Epstein called Fagin the Thief, which I think is terrific. And by the way, I'm going to give Allison a plug because I signed up for it. She writes this wonderful Substack thing, and it's called Dirtbags Through History. And she picks on, she does a wonderful job looking at figures that are
I
actually
think that
dirtbags. I mean, that's
some
the definition.
because the real life Fagin finished up in Tasmania.
Yeah,
He finished up being transported as a convict to Port Arthur in Tasmania.
he did.
Um,
And her book does end with him being,
oh, excellent.
transported. But I think she did a marvelous job. But the point is, when you look at the living conditions and you look at the crimes and, the sentences are disproportionate but
Yeah,
as you point out, they're really crimes against property. They weren't running around killing people. They were
no,
running around stealing
yeah.
handkerchiefs and,
The
and
rich
just trying
didn't.
to survive.
Yeah, and this was very much going back to the days of serfs and property owners. They were terrified that someone would rise up because Britain didn't have its sort of French Revolution or its Russian Revolution where the peasants rose up, but the wealthy and the aristocracy were always terrified it was going to happen there, and they wanted to make sure that they kept the poor poor.
Right. So you have been in Australia for many, many years, but your book reads as though you're actually living in London. So how do you maintain, that familiarity with a place that you're no longer actually living in?
I go back regularly, although I must admit, post-COVID and pre-COVID, I'd go back probably twice a year. I think I missed seeing you last year at Capital Crime because that was a research trip. I went across to do some publicity, but mainly that was for research purposes to research the White Crow. So I get back and forth, but I should let you know, I did mention earlier that I was going to do another Philomena book, but there is going to be a book in between. The question I get most often asked when I'm traveling, particularly obviously in Australia, is why is it that an Australian writer has written 19 novels now and not a single one of them has been set in Australia? Uh,
Excellent point.
yeah, and what I often would tell people is I have and I have had in my bottom drawer for nearly well more than 30 years. I've had what I refer to as Australia's greatest ever unpublished novel, which was almost published in 1995. I missed out by a single vote by Penguin. I was living in the UK. Um, and they said if I'd set that same story in England, Ireland, Scotland, or Wales, they would have published it in a heartbeat. But because it was set in Australia, it was a little too hard to sell. And up until that point, very few Australian novels had ever been successful internationally. And so as of next year, that book that I began writing when I was 25 years old, so 40 years ago, has now been rewritten extensively, and it will be published next year. It's my 20th novel, will be the first one I ever set in Australia. But then I'll be going back to Philomena.
Okay. Well, we have to give you a pass given the fact that, yes, that's really so fascinating. Isn't it interesting how publishers view the world often differently than how everybody else views the world?
Yeah, well, so I was told probably 10 or 15 years ago, I was told by a very, very senior publisher, who I won't name, that they would be happy if I set a book anywhere in the world except Australia.
And was there a rationale behind that?
A rationale behind that and was that no Australian crime novel up until that point had been successful internationally since perhaps John Cleary or Arthur Upton, going back to the sort of 50s and 60s. And I remember saying to this publisher, yes, but that is until one of them is. And of course, it was after that that Leanne Moriarty and Jane Harper and some of these astonishingly successful books, set in Australia, wowed the New York and London and wherever. And so this time around, when I said to my international publishers, oh, by the way, I'm going to set a book in Australia, got a totally different reaction. They said, what a great idea.
I love that. That's so interesting. I can remember the first time I went to, excuse me, I'm coughing here.
I shall have a copy.
I was astonished at the price of books. And I think part of the reason was that most of the books were manufactured in the UK and shipped to Australia. In fact, I scored one of my larger book selling triumphs. I'm trying to remember the man's name. You probably will. I think he lived in Tasmania, and he wrote a really fascinating book in which, when it was printed, the chapters were all in different colors. Was that ringing a bell with
Oh,
you? And he won a huge prize.
Matthew Riley, was it?
No, no, it wasn't. I can't think of his name. But anyway, he was coming. I
Richard
read the
Flanagan.
book.
Yeah.
And he was coming to New York for some kind of a convention or something of the sort. And the American publisher either didn't have the book yet or was sold out of it yet. I can't remember which. And and so I contacted the Australian publisher or the Tasmanian Australian publisher, and they actually shipped the remaining copies of this book to New York where he signed them, and then they shipped them to me. And and I thought about the freight and all the rest of it involved. And then I thought about why the cost of books in Australia, if that's how things came. But Australia now has a really vibrant publishing scene.
Yeah.
I mean, I hear from Allen and Unwin.
Going back 20 years ago, I think my first novel, When the Suspect, was published. It was published internationally, but rather than and it was shipped into Australia. They shipped 6,000 copies into Australia, and then because there wasn't really much a facility to print large copies, and Australia's not a huge market, which means economies of scale mean that, for a novel, unless it's going to sell a certain number of copies, it actually makes more sense to ship copies in than to try to print them here, because otherwise they'll be remaindered here or whatnot. But no, we would very much, historically, we would get the American books sent to us or the British books sent to us. But you're right, now we have, well, you've got an involvement with some of the wonderful Australian writers that are Solari Gentle and Gary Dish is doing incredibly well now internationally, and we have obviously Jane Harper, Chris Hammy. We've got some wonderful, wonderful writers that are breaking through.
Absolutely so. In fact, Jane Harper's Tasmanian book is currently running on, I can't remember whether it's Amazon or Netflix. And one of the glories of turning crime novels or any novels anymore into television is that drone photography allows absolutely breathtaking scenery. So one of the reasons to watch the Jane Harper, aside from the story, was the photography of this area of Tasmania with the stunning cliffs and the amazing sea and all the rest of it. And so I think actually more rugged landscapes like Australia, Tasmania, or even here in the American West are doing well, partly because of the brilliance of the photography.
Yeah. Well, I also think it's funny, going back, and you'll remember this, not that long ago, Americans would tend to read, if we just stick to crime fiction, would read American crime fiction, and the British would read British crime fiction, and there were plenty of those and whatnot. And in Australia, we read whatever we got sent. But the thing that's changed, I think, over the last probably 25 years is that readers are willing and enjoy reading books set all over the world. They embraced, the Scandi noir sort of thing. They wanted to be in Venice with Donna Leone, and they wanted to be, in Edinburgh with Ian Rankin and Rebus, and I think that's the great beauty. We can travel the world as readers, and explore different places.
Absolutely true. But the fact that there are movies being made internationally, the fact that translators have been doing wonderful work, so that, I mean, for a long time, crime fiction was really kind of an English construct. It was really British and adapted in America. But now the Japanese are killing it. And we already know that, the Nordic countries have produced amazing stuff. But it's also now followed on television. I mean, there are 3 fabulous Finnish crime shows, which I would not
have you got into Department Q yet?
Oh, saw it all and thought it was wonderful.
Amazing.
And at first from the title, I thought it was UC Adler, whatever his name is, the Swiss guy, because he has a title somewhat similar to it. So I was.
Well, it is UC Adler. It's the Danish, isn't it? Danish writer. It's based on.
Maybe he's Danish, but he is Scandinavian.
Yeah.
You're right. I
So,
think he is Danish, not Swedish. Anyway, I was surprised to discover myself in London because I thought it was going because he's really written some amazing books. But
yeah.
now, we're finding all over the world, we're finding crime fiction being written by authors in those countries, and they're being translated, they're being turned into film. And so it has become a really international landscape. Well, look at you and me having this conversation. We would have had a really hard time doing this 10 or 12 years ago.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. Definitely. No, no, it does allow it's a wonderful way, as I say, of exploring the world. And as I say, I do hope with Philomena and this series, I would love, as I say, it's in pre-production. Well, the scripts are being written and all that. I think I'd love to see that come to fruition actually, because I think that would be it'd be I can just see a lot of actors wanting to play the roles of the gangster brothers and
Absolutely. No,
yeah.
I think there are many parts that actors would really like to sink their teeth in. But I mean, as with any great and truly fair crime novel, the crime is resolved, but there are personal threads and so forth that are left to be continued. And that's why I say, what's going to happen to Henry? What's going to happen to Philomena? Does her family get to build the property? I mean, there's all kinds.
There's all sorts of scope. I mean, I think I don't know really, but I looked at mentioning long form storytelling on TV. I mean, Breaking Bad was obviously astonishingly successful series, but when you looked at the character progression through that series of Walter White, the mild-mannered sort of chemistry teacher, science teacher, and what he became.
Yeah.
You can sort of see that there's a lot of ways for Philomena to go, in this family, going forward. So many storylines that are possible. So
Look at Anne Cleves, Michael. I mean, look at Shetland, and now she's going to the Orkneys because the Shetland, kind of got done. Look at Vera, 12 seasons of Vera and the
I
evolution.
know I got into great trouble at a festival the other day when I said that I didn't like Vera.
Ah, well,
I
I
don't even
think
know. It's funny. I love Vera in the books. I adore Vera in the books. But with the TV series, this idea of calling everyone pet and all she's got to do is make them a cup of tea and they confess to her. I just didn't like the TV versions. But
the
I adore
earl
the
the
book.
earlier ones before, you know, it tends to settle into a certain number of tropes, but the
Yeah.
early ones were different. That's what happened with Shetland.
Yeah.
I mean, you could tell that Jimmy was bored, and frankly, the last one where Jimmy was the detective, the ending of it was just as ridiculous as the one in Downton Abbey, and when the guy wanted to go off to Hollywood, so they had him drive into a tree. I mean, come on. I thought Julian Fellows could have done so much better
No
with
spoilers. No spoilers. No, I know.
too bad. But I do think that it does. I know Ian told me once that the horror of the original Rebus was that they had an hour less commercials to do a Rebus book, which were complex and all. And I urged him to buy them back, because
Mm.
by then he could certainly afford it, to buy them back and have them done properly. And I think it was hard for those early acquisitions where,
Yeah.
but
I
now,
think that happened to me in with the Joe Locken series in
yeah,
Germany. They made seven, I think, hour and a half long dramas, but it's just not long enough because so much of the storyline and so much of the interpersonal stuff has to be ditched when you're trying to tell a big story in only an hour and a half.
no, it's absolutely true. Well, I know you are required to get to Canberra and it's a long drive. So let me call Patrick up and see if there are any questions or comments. And I'm going to look up the name of the book from the Tasmanian author because it's really annoying me that I
I,
can't.
I'm telling you, could it be Richard Flanagan?
That's it.
There you go. Yeah, yeah. Probably Gould's Book of Fish. He had a few
That
books.
was it. Gould's Book of Fish, exactly.
Yeah.
And it was
But when you said
printed.
different colors, I think it had beautiful illustrations in it.
Yep.
Beautiful illustrations of fish in it. He's one of our finest, finest, finest writers, Richard Flanagan. I mean,
Well, he's a
he's won a
prince of a
Booker
guy.
Prize with Miles Franklin and yeah.
Yeah. I still think of him sitting there in New York as the ship came in with all of his books from Tasmania and signing them all and shipping on to us. It was amazing. It was one of my favorite moments in a long career of book selling. Patrick, are you there? There he is.
Whoops, I'm here.
Good.
Yeah, let's see here. Stefania's got a question. She says it's very interesting the contrast between the police officer and her gangster family. Do you think that it's certain family, let's see, then it's certain family ties we can't escape completely? Blood is thicker than water, that kind of idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's one of the things that this explores. It's. I did actually do some research. It is possible to become a police officer in the UK and in a lot of other countries, even if you come from a family with deep criminal ties. You do have to prove that you are not yourself a criminal, or you're not, that you've got some distance between them. But I guess, in the course of this book, this is one of the things that, in both books actually, that Philomena, and they're both completely can be read as standalones, which I'm sure Barbara will attest to. You don't have to have read one to read the other. The This idea of, where Philomena has to decide who she trusts, and whether she trusts the badge or her own flesh and blood, because there are good and bad people on both sides of that equation. There are, and I can see that increasingly being the dilemma she faces, that even with their own police force, these people that are sworn to protect and serve the public, there is corruption. There are people that have hidden agendas, and so I love exploring that dynamic of divided loyalties. And when push comes to shove, someone asked me last night at an event that if I had someone very close to me committed a crime, would I turn them in? You know, um, and I remember pausing to think, well, clearly it would depend on the crime, if it was a very serious crime or not. You know, but yeah, it's a wonderful area to explore, this idea of loyalties and family loyalties and blood being.
And don't you think it's particularly difficult when it's a parent and child?
Yeah, I think that's what I was thinking most of, if it was my child. It's one of those things that Paul Britton, the psychologist I mentioned earlier, where he said even serial killers had a mother. You know what I mean? And it's why you see so often, outside of courtrooms, or when someone is charged with a terrible crime, you'll see a parent there trying to defend them, saying, "You don't know them like I know them." That really they're very sweet. That will try to put the best possible spin on things. And yeah, I mean, it's ever thus. It's the reason that when you have a child, you embrace that child and you don't abandon the child. That it's an unconditional sort of love that you have, and that would make it very difficult, I think. Yeah, but again, I think it would depend. It's a bit like, it would depend. I mean, if I thought they needed help, and that was the only way to get them help, then yes. But yeah, it would depend on the crime, I think. And I hope I'm never in that situation. Thank you for ever asked that question. I will probably not be able to sleep tonight thinking about that.
Trish asks, thank you. She says, thank you, Michael, for coming out early on a winter morning. You're busy marketing White Crow at the moment. Will you get time to write today?
Will I get started right today? I'm hoping I will. I'm taking the Australian novel I mentioned is already delivered, and I've begun working on a new Philomena novel, and I'm writing longhand at the moment, which I tend to do to start with. And so I will hopefully get a little bit of writing done some point this afternoon. Before I do, I've got an event tonight at the National Library in Canberra, which is Australia's capital. So it's and hopefully I'll get. I try to write every day. It's like breathing. I have to keep doing it. And partly it's because of my own sense of doubt, that if I don't write every day, I begin thinking that's a terrible idea. What makes me think that's a good idea? This is the book that's going to expose me as being a complete fraud. I have no idea what I'm doing. But if I write every day, I can keep looking at it saying, okay, it's terrible, but it's not so terrible that I can't fix it. I can polish that turd until it shines.
Let's see here. Yeah, the question is there a particular legend about a white crow? The title is so particular.
No, it's more about the fact that they do exist in the wild. They're an albino form of, so many you do get albinoism in certain animals. And in the wild, it means that they become more easily prey for predators, if you know. It makes them more vulnerable to be a white crow. And I guess it's funny, titles are an interesting thing. I don't have a great track record with coming up with titles for my books. That's the British version. The And The White Crow, I love that title, but I purposely didn't put it on the book. I called it something else when I delivered it because I wanted someone in the publishing houses to find The White Crow and say, what about that? Because then I could go, oh, what a brilliant idea. And if they think it's their idea, they're far more on board with it. Because I was terrified that in the past I've come up with what I thought were brilliant titles, and they've all spent so long debating it and decide, this and that. So anyway, I was so pleased when someone came back to me and said, "What about The White Crow?" And I could do my forehead slap and go, "Oh, you're brilliant." But no, I did love I do love that title. I think it works so well with Phil. The fact that she, the whole idea of being white and being the outsider in the family, and and they're all black crows, and she's the one white one. I just think is a great image. It's led to wonderful imagery in the marketing campaigns, and things like that. They could do wonderful things with that.
Similar to a black sheep.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Let's see. Are there any kind of up and coming Australian crime writers that we may not have heard of that you'd recommend?
Yeah, there's lots, but I just don't know if they're being published in America at the moment or yet. But Barbara's going to be better at this than I.
Well, yeah, she's Irish by birth, but Dervla McTiernan, who
Oh,
lives
that was wonderful.
is
Yeah.
wonderful. She was up for a thriller award, and I had a moment to spend time with her when I was at Thriller Fest. And so you may not have run into Dervla. And Sulari Gentle, whom Michael has mentioned, she'll be coming to the US. She's going to debut her new novel, which is a riff on Murder on the Orient Express, based on a trip she actually took with her sister on the Orient Express. So she'll be kicking that off on Sunday, August, whatever it is, 17th, something like that, here at the bookstore. So I think that's great. And then there
And
was
that
somebody,
was a good choice. Yeah.
yeah, and then you agreed to join me in talking to another Australian author, a woman whose name I'm completely blanking out on. We did that Zoom together, Michael.
Oh,
Um,
good. Now you're going to put me on the
yeah,
spot.
I like 2 years ago, maybe, but she worshipped at your altar, and so you were kind of she
People
did.
shouldn't worship at my altar.
Yeah,
No, there are some wonderful new ones. There are, Ali Lowe and Danuka McKenzie, and there are so many, and they're just sort of starting. And what I love most, which didn't really exist when I started writing, there is such a community of particularly crime writers here in Australia. And whenever I see one of these books being launched, there are probably a dozen other authors in the audience. They support each other. They go to each other's book launches.
yeah.
They have lunch together. They help edit each other's books in a sense of reading, become designated readers, and enormous sense of camaraderie there, which is something quite new, particularly amongst female writers. And yeah, I mean, I used to laugh that you couldn't swing a cat in Scotland without hitting a crime writer. I feel as though you can't. I feel as though now in Australia it's a bit the same. There are so many new ones, and um, uh, what I'm just absolutely not sure about is I know Derva's definitely being published in America very successfully, and Solari. But yeah, there's another Chris Hammer is a wonderful writer, but I don't know whether he's being published in America. But he's very big in the UK. He writes very much in that Jane Harper style of they call it outback noir almost, small towns.
I think he is. I do think he is. And there are two or three New Zealand crime writers who are now published here in
Yeah,
the United States. Grove Atlantic is publishing one whose first name is Michael, and I'm having a blank on the
Michael
second.
Bennett
Thank you, Michael Bennett. I did his
is very
actual
good.
book launch for the first one that Grove did, and he's part Maori, and
Yeah.
so he's kind of a Tony
Oh, another one I
Hillerman.
should mention, JP Josh Pomare. JP
Yes.
Pomare is a wonderful writer. He's again a New Zealander, part Maori, lives in Australia. He's a wonderful writer, and I think I hate them because they're young and they're good looking. But what can I say? I will still shout them out.
Oh, I think that camaraderie, goes across the board. You're right. If you are looking, so Larry Gentle has an Instagram account, and she seems to appear at every gathering of Australian crime writers, which are frequent. And so if you follow her, you will pick up names of authors that she is doing selfies and so forth with. And you're right. It seems to be a really embracing community, and they always look as though they are having the most wonderful time.
Yeah. I mean, I think I always say about with when you write in the genre that I write in, that, we take our writing very seriously, but we don't take ourselves too seriously. And that way we can sort of hopefully produce books that you will love to read, but we're not going to be up ourselves.
Yay. Well, in Australia, I think it would be hard to be way above
Yeah,
yourself,
we
isn't
have
it?
we have yeah. Well, I have a wife that makes sure I get cut down to size. It's almost like like I did an event last night with 200 people there, and I come in buzzing, and she'll just come in and sort of saying the drain's blocked, please fix it. Doesn't last long.
Gotcha. Anything else, Patrick?
I think that's about it.
All right. Well, we need to let Michael go because he has miles to go in difficult weather. So I wish you luck getting to Canberra for your wonderful um, event this evening. And it's July 2nd in Australia, but today, July 1st, is actually the publication
United
date
States.
here in the
Happy
United
publication
States.
day to me. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Patrick. It's always
Thank
an
you.
absolute pleasure to chat.
Thank you very
Thanks
much,
so
Michael.
much.
Bye.